Camera roll 317-16, sound roll 317-9.
We're finally ready to go. You came to the government in September of 1933, as you just told me. What was it like, and not just at that time, but what was it like in general to be a black man in the government or involved in the government in the New Deal at that time?
Well, there were no precedents. The closest thing that was to it was what happened in World War I, when Emmett Scott and George Haynes were involved in war production at that time. However, their functions were quite different from the functions that were outlined in the New Deal. One of the things that interested me in the New Deal and interested John Davis, who was a person that worked with me and got me at least identified somewhat with the movement, was the fact that here you had the federal government assuming responsibilities that it had never assumed before in peacetime. And this meant that the economic structure of the country would be impacted to a degree that it had never been impacted before by the federal government and by the legislation and administrative action in the federal government. Well, as an economist and one who was interested primarily in employment as far as Negro Americans were concerned, and we were Negroes at that time, I was intrigued by this. First, I was intrigued by its potentialities, and secondly, I was frightened by the dangers of its coming and not coming with a philosophy and a policy of the involvement and somewhat equitable activity for the minority group of which I was a member.
You said there were dangers. What were
The
dangers?
The dangers were these, that if you had, for example, one of the issues that came up was whether or not blacks should fight for equal pay for equal work. And this was not a theoretical problem. There were many parts of the country and many individuals and many blacks in America who felt that if there were equal wages, then they would be displaced in toto. And by this fear, they found themselves being lined up with the reactionary whites who wanted it because that would mean that they would be able to get Negroes cheaper than before. That was not the totality of it, however, because if there were a wage differential based upon race, then the hostility that had existed and continues to exist to some degree between white and black labor would be accentuated. And you would never have any hope of having any labor movement which would include blacks. And you would never have any rapprochement between labor organizers and labor officials and black organizers and black officials.
Okay. I want to move on now to talk about Walter White. Can you tell me a little bit? You knew him pretty well. Can you tell me about Walter White and tell me what kind of a man Walter White was?
Walter White was a very complex person, as I think all people are who are doing things. He was primarily a public relations man. He was primarily a man who used his personality, his industry, and his unflappability to be able to project what he was trying to get done. And in this, he was sort of, once he set out on a project, he had the tenacity of a bulldog on it. And he also had a great deal of personal charm when that was necessary, and he knew how to handle people with a degree of flattery which was not insincere, but was very effective. So that he was a great proponent for the programs and the policies that he espoused. He also collected around himself a group of quite competent people, and they had, by and large, great loyalty for him. Obviously...
Sorry, if I can just direct this, with
Yeah.
talking about Walter White. You know, we've talked about, in the Depression, he was very single-minded about the anti-lynching
Yes.
law. Why of all the things that were affecting black people at that time, why do you suppose that it was the anti-lynching law that was his obsession,
Well, I think that Walter White believed, and I think justifiably, that lynching was not only a horrible, bestial thing for people to be doing, but that it had a tremendous symbolism and a tremendous impact upon the black population, because if lynching could occur, it meant that Negro Americans would not have the protection granted in theory by the Constitution, supposedly supported by the courts, of a trial and a presumption of innocence until proved to be guilty. In addition, it was a tremendous instrument for getting people to feel insecure, to getting blacks to feel frightened, and to getting them to feel that they were in danger constantly, so that they could be further penalized by discrimination and by fear and by innuation and all of those activities. And the interesting thing about this was that many white Americans who were favorably involved and favorably inclined towards blacks seemed to minimize the impact of lynching, not the act of lynching, but the impact of lynching occurring, because there was a feeling that there was progress being made and that there were not as many lynchings as before. But from Walter's point of view, it wasn't the number of lynchings that he was concerned with, it was the fact that you did have lynchings. And if you had had only 10, it would have been a great deterrent to the black population. And I think he was right.
Great, thank you. Cut for a second, please.
Absolutely. I'm hearing a lot. Slide, please.
Take two, camera rolls, 317,
Mark it.
16, sound.
In the early 30s, actually, the number of lynchings did jump up in 1933. What relationship do you think the economics of the Depression had to do with the prevalence, the recurring prevalence of lynchings?
Well, as I said before, the very impact of lynching could not be separated from the deterrent that it was economically to black Americans. The fact that there was always the possibility of maybe a trumped-up charge, maybe a misidentification or something of that sort, of penalizing this with the supreme penalty of a Negro who was either too aggressive or was too pushy or was too prosperous, meant that this put a pale over the economic possibilities of getting a job, of holding a job, of getting promotion, of asking for a promotion, and of really asserting any of the basic principles of citizenship which we were led to believe were universal in this country.
Was this exacerbated by the Depression, do you think?
It was exacerbated in the Depression, because in the Depression there was even more competition for jobs because there were less jobs. So that when you had a black in a position or in a job, which a lot of whites wanted, there would be a direct reaction, negative reaction towards that black by certain whites in certain areas. And lynching was the extreme expression of that hostility.
Great, thank you.
Okay, we have 50.
Okay, cut for a second.
Cut, all right. Mark it.
So in that time when you were 27 years old and 26 years old,
Well, of course, remember, I had grown up in Washington. My father was in government. He was a postal clerk, civil service postal clerk. My grandfather step-grandfather was in government. And I had known a large number of people, many, not a large number, but a reasonable number of black Americans who were in government, the record of deeds and this and that and the other, with a few traditional jobs, so that the idea of being in government per se did not have much impact on me one way or the other. I had all of the enthusiasm of youth, and I had all of the self-confidence that youth sometimes has, or at least it affects having if it doesn't have. And I was very, very much involved in the job, in the potential of it, and in the hopes of it. So I felt that this was a real opportunity, and I must say that I did not feel frightened in the least. I felt I had about as much chance as anybody else of doing the job, and I had had success in the Negro Industrial League in appearing before the NRA and testifying, and got very good publicity in the Times and even the Wall Street Journal. So that I felt really that it was an opportunity, but I did not feel any great fear about it.
Thank you. That's Margaret, please.
Take 4.
Okay, Walter White carried on an extensive correspondence with Mrs. Roosevelt, and they had an extensive relationship. What kind of a friendship was that? I mean, how would you characterize that?
Well, it was an ongoing friendship, which...
I'm sorry, could you start by saying
No.
Walter White and
Walter White had cultivated Mrs. Roosevelt, and it was a mutual sort of exchange, and he would, without hesitancy, write anybody, anytime, anywhere, when he thought anything would come out of that as far as the work of the NAACP was concerned. And in Mrs. Roosevelt, he found something of a responsive ear. She certainly did not tear up his letters, as far as I know anything about it, and anybody knows anything about it. And she did respond, sometimes in writing, sometimes through a third party, and she was interested. And this was very rewarding to him. This I can attest to from my own experience. But he reached her by a letter. He also reached her by third parties. Mrs. Bethune, for example, who had access to Mrs. Roosevelt, would often go and present the issue or issues that Walter was interested in. And there was no, apparently, resentment on Mrs. Roosevelt's part about being inundated by this, and there was response insofar as she felt that she could do so with impunity.
Did she ever, so she didn't feel beleaguered by him, she was happy to respond. I know they exchanged a lot of letters. She was active in this issue with regard to her husband. Why was she so ready to respond?
Well, I think she was ready to respond, and I'm sure she did not respond positively to all of the matters that Walter brought to her attention, because she was concerned about these issues herself. She was distraught at times whenever instances of discrimination, gross discrimination, would be brought to her attention from any source. And she would attempt to do whatever she could. And she was a very adroit person, and she used various and sundry methods. I remember one in which I was involved when there was a luncheon on the White House, and Mrs. Roosevelt had been written this was in war production period, about the fact that blacks were not being given equal opportunity or hardly any opportunity in war production. And she wrote a very disarming note to Mr. Hillman saying this had happened, and would he mind telling her what was going on. And so he wrote back rather feebly, and to make a long story short, she set up a luncheon in which she, Sidney Hillman, Will Alexander, and I, and Aubrey Williams were present. She then asked Mr. Hillman again what was happening in these situations, and he opened up by saying that Dr. Will Alexander and I wouldn't agree with him, but that progress was being made. And she then called on Dr. Alexander and myself to say what we thought, and we disagreed strongly with him, as he knew we were going to do. And at the end of the meeting, she said, well, she felt that there was some validity in this, and she was sure the president didn't know anything about it, but she would call it to his attention. And I must say that we got a lot done the next week. This was the way in which she moved.
Great.
Take that.
Parking?
Okay, then again on the you ready?
Yes.
On the subject of lynching, FDR never supported publicly an anti-lynching law.
No.
Why not?
Well, it's largely for political reasons.
Again, could you start by saying that the President Roosevelt, or after Mr. Roosevelt, didn't?
It was the fact that he was dependent upon a Southern-dominated Congress, where you had, with the continuing re-election of Democratic candidates for both Senate and the House in these Southern districts, the chairmanship of the committees, which were very powerful, were dominated by the Southerners. And if he were to go too far out, and nobody knows how far out he could have gone, but there's one thing sure, there was a point where he could have gone to so far that they would have just rebelled and not supported his program for the recovery and then later for defense. And he was too good a politician not to recognize that. I think also the fact was that he was, and I think he was a great president, but he was no great civil rights champion. He had lived in the South, he had lived in Georgia, he had lived, and he had accustomed himself to, and accommodated himself to the Southern pattern of race relations. And I think he felt that that this was not a burning issue, and he did not have the feeling that Mrs. Roosevelt had of the fact that it was something that should be changed.
Great, thank you.
Or could be changed.
Well, let me ask you another question then. I mean, a lot of blacks, it seemed like a lot of blacks loved, revered President Roosevelt. Given that he wasn't such a civil rights champion, why did they love him so? And again, if you could start the question by saying, as a full statement, you know.
Yeah, of course, there's the other side of it, and that was the fact that he had this great personality. I remember, before I went even to Washington, hearing these fireside chats over the radio, and you go through a Negro district, and every radio is on, and practically every household is listening, and practically everyone who's listening is thinking he's talking to that person alone and personally. There was this personality that he had of enveloping people and of including them, and with the optimism that he had. There was also the fact that he was very adroit in sending messages to conferences where a large number of blacks would be assembled, or finding a man who was about to lose his farm, who happened to be black, and saving his farm for him. And of course he had Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt was loved by black Americans and was revered by them and was trusted by them, and they were really feeling as a part of government through the fact that they felt a part of the woman who was married to the president.
Great, thank you. Can we cut for a second?
Take 6, camera roll 17.
Can you describe briefly for me what Charles Houston's, Walter White was with the anti-lynching campaign. Charles Houston had a legal strategy to end desegregation.
Yeah.
Can you describe what his strategy was?
What it was?
Yeah.
Well, it was a strategy.
Can you start with
Yeah.
Charles Houston's strategy?
Charles Houston's strategy is well summarized by Gina Ray McNeil's title to his biography, Groundwork. It was the figuring out in a very logical and a very careful and a very complete program of how you attempted to break down the discrimination and segregation in the public schools in this country. The first thing that he felt was that you could not do this by having a broadside frontal attack and wipe out all segregation and all inequalities. That this would simply cause a backlash, and it would frighten whites and anger whites, but it would frighten a lot of blacks too, because the schools were a very, very significant part of the economy. The black middle class was largely supported by the salaries that school teachers earned, black school teachers earned, despite the fact that in most places, as in the case of my mother-in-law, they were paid just about half of what the whites were paid with equal qualifications. So that he recognized that it was important to get precedent after precedent and to go after the precedents that could be established more quickly and with less pain and with less expenditure, effort, and money, because both were limited. And to get, as I say, gains after gains which were precedents and which could be expanded further. Now, the elements that were involved in this, as I recall, was first there's the element of education. And this is education of the public I'm talking about rather than of the kids in the school. To let the public know, and particularly the black public and the white public, what the conditions were. So here's a man.
I'm sorry, sir. We just ran out of film. Sorry.
Marking, please.
Okay, change camera roll to 18, take 7.
Thank you. Good slate.
Charles Houston had a very well worked out program to fight education discrimination and education segregation. There were several elements in it. One of the basic elements was first to emphasize what could and had to be done to cut out the discrimination in salaries of teachers, discrimination in the length of the school term, discrimination in the facilities in the school system, discrimination in professional education. Never did he forsake or forget that the ultimate objective was to get a breakdown of racial segregation in public education. He started out, among other things, some of the earliest ones was matters of education of the general public, education of the Negro public, education to show what the situation was. Here was a man, talented lawyer, would drive all over the country taking pictures of what existed in the school system. And he would then devise, by using the crisis and other media, to show these to the publics that he wanted to influence on this. He then had to work with the teachers, he and his immediate colleagues, the colored teachers, to show them that they were being terribly mistreated by being equally prepared in many instances and not being paid the same amount of money. If they said that the Negroes' children were harder to teach, then they should deserve more money, not less money. And if they were not harder to teach, then they should deserve it for the same reason. He then got a...
what about the legal strategy then? What was the legal strategy?
Well, the legal strategy was how you brought the cases up before the Supreme Court and how you got them to the Supreme Court and what the issues that were raised in these various cases. Because each time you won a victory, this made a precedent which you could cite in the next case. And then the precedent could be cited in the next case, and so on. You get some of the earlier cases, and these were not in any sequence as far as the game pattern was concerned, but the sequence as the cases matured, because he could not decide which cases would come up. He had to find out which cases he could get people to bring. He couldn't bring the cases. He had to get this done. So that you had a case that was brought to his attention by his favorite student and later his closest associate, Thurgood Marshall in Virginia, where a young man by the name of Gaines in Baltimore, graduate of Amherst, attempted to get into the University of Maryland law school.
Okay.
And
can you hold on for a second? Don't keep going. Cut. Market, please.
Okay, take the camera roll 18.
So, given that we know what happened, what is the significance of the Donald Gaines? It's Donald Gaines Murray versus University of Maryland Law School.
Well, the Donald Gaines case showed that by excellent preparation and by having an excellent plaintiff, that the lower court, federal court, sustained the school system, the university. However, he was able to get a superior court, the Court of Appeals, to accept the case and make a decision in favor of the plaintiff. This then set a precedent that the courts would overturn this type of professional education case if it were carefully presented, if it had a good plaintiff, and if it had expert lawyers. Then the next time that this came up, it came up in Missouri, and here it came finally to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court certified that this would have to be done. Now, there were a lot of issues in this, but I won't go into them at this time.
Was there a sense at the time that the Donald Gaines Murray against that victory happened, was there a sense that this was a breakthrough? Was there a feeling that this was a major...
Oh, yeah. The interesting thing about it was in every instance where a new area was opened up, equal pay for equal training, equal school terms, equal transportation, equal facilities, equal professional education opportunities. Every time that this happened, there was a realization, first in the black community, that there was hope and that there was a good prospect of change. This was it's a metamorphosis, because people, I remember when I was a kid in school, in separate school in Washington, there was no hope that this was going to be broken down, although at one time you did not have separate schools in Washington for a short period in Reconstruction. So this was a terribly important thing. And as each victory was won, there was a much more receptive audience and a much more receptive clientele pushing. And even if he had not wanted to go further with this, I think he would have been forced to, because nothing succeeds as does success.
Great, thank you. We do it. Okay. Let me ask you something, a more general question about the NAACP at that time in the mid-30s. You got your anti-lynching campaign, you have your Houston strategy. What, at that time in the 30s, and it seems like it was a critical period, what was the mission of the NAACP? What?
Well, the NAACP's mission was to get equal opportunity and full rights.
Can we start again? Let's start over.
Yeah.
About the NAACP.
The NAACP's mission was to get equal opportunity and equal political participation by blacks in this country. As time went on, it moved more and more into the area of economics, of equal job opportunities, of fighting discrimination in labor unions, of fighting the disfranchisement.
How did the NAACP get its message out to all across the country to people? How did they was there an attempt to expand their membership at this time?
Yes.
How did they do that?
It was a membership organization, and it was an organization made up of a series of local branches. In these local branches, there would usually be an individual, man or woman, who was outstanding in the community, sometimes a man who had a church, as Adam Clayton Powell Sr. Was a leader in NAACP in New York City. Or it would be maybe an educator. But that was more difficult because the educator was usually employed by the state or the city, and usually the problems were with the state and the city. Or it would be a doctor, or it would be a lawyer. And this was Du Bois's talented 10th that would take the leadership in the NAACP. In the South, the same thing occurred. It was much less aggressive in the South than in the North, but it was an organization that had a membership made up of people who belonged to existing organizations in the communities where they lived. And also there was the Crisis magazine, which was edited by Du Bois. In fact, my first publicity was in the Crisis, because Du Bois had gotten an idea of having a picture issue of young children of Negro families. And my brother and my picture appeared in this, and sometimes I guess I was 4 or 5 years old. And this got my family to subscribe to the Crisis. And the Crisis was also an outlet for people who were writing on these issues that were important to black Americans. It also had an educational section, and each year there would be a list of the graduates from outstanding universities, undergraduate and graduate, and what they had done.
Now, the talented 10th, the people in the communities were the, is that it? Yeah. We just ran out of time. Great, thank you.
Exchange victories and defeats, so that it was an organization that kept going by the local people. The central office had a field staff. Pickens was one of the field staff people of Yale, an early Yale graduate. And he was a great orator, and you had a lot of women as well as men, outstanding women and men who were spokesmen for the NAACP. And as it grew older, it set up sections in litigation, sections in education, sections in employment.
Change camera roll 19.
Mark it.
Okay, again, just briefly, tell me about...
As time went on, more than... As time went on, more people than the field staff were out in the community. The executive directors were going hither and yon, would have meetings in various cities, and the other people in the central office would get out into the communities, going out usually when there was a situation of local importance, and taking that, analyzing that, and tying that into the association and to a membership drive.
Great, thank you. Now to switch gears a little bit, we're still rolling, right?
Yes.
To Marian Anderson concert. Now we're going to tell in the film all the history of what happened with the DAR and the Constitution Hall. But after that, a concert was arranged at the Lincoln Memorial, and you were around then. Can you tell me how that concert got arranged?
Yes.
How that happened?
As you know, Mrs. Roosevelt had resigned from the Daughters of the American Revolution in protest. This immediately activated two officials in the Interior Department, Oscar Chapman, who was a young white Virginian, very liberal, and an assistant secretary, and Harold Ickes, who was the secretary. And it was they who made the Lincoln Memorial reflection pool area available. And it was they who were on the podium when, I think with the degree of irony, Marian Anderson, after having gone through that dramatic experience, opened her mouth and sang, "My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing." It was a moving experience.
Was there much outcry that government property was being used for this? Was there protesting?
There wasn't in Washington, and there may have been in Waycross, Georgia, but there was not much in Washington.
Okay. Can you tell me, you were at the concert.
Yes.
Can you go back a little bit, and I know you just told me some of it, but again, kind of go back. What was it like to be there? Were you there among the crowd, and were you with, and what was the feeling at that concert at that time?
Well, it was just the concert was a meeting and a gathering of hundreds and I guess thousands of people all around this enormous reflection pool there, and it was hushed. It was almost like a tribute, as it were. Miss Anderson was introduced by Ickes. She sang, she was applauded, and I think everybody in the audience felt a little bit better after that than they did before they heard her.
Okay, now we'll move on to Joe Louis. What do you think it was about Joe Louis that captured the imagination of so many black people? Why him?
Well, let me say one word of Joe Louis had a honesty and an inherent decency, an inherent wit that won many people. He was sometimes ungrammatical, but he was not a Stephen Fetchit type at all. It happened that my wife was teaching at Howard University during the time of his rise, and she had his sister in her class, and she was a very, very able student. And Joe had many witticisms which came almost spontaneously. My favorite one was the story that somebody asked Joe after the first smelling fight, when he'd had a great physical and psychological defeat, if he saw the movies of the fight. He said, "No, I saw the fight."
Take 10, camera roll 19.
Second sticks, but when you slap it, don't move it out.
Oh,
It's
that's right,
much
you need to
blurry,
see.
right.
Okay,
Do it
again.
again. Take 3, sticks.
Take 10.
Third sticks. Okay, so back to Joe Louis. What did he mean to you? You as a man in government and a sophisticated person, what did Joe mean to you?
Well, Joe was a very complex person to many black Americans. There were many things that came to mind. There was the Jack Johnson situation when Johnson had been either dived or
We'll tell the Jack Johnson situation. We'll tell
and here you had a young guy who was clean living, who was not a great complex personality, had 2 excellent managers, and a remarkable trainer, and really was everything that an American athlete could be honored because he had these attributes. He had no guile. He was not conceited. He was not self-depreciating. And he was just a fine person who was given with a great talent, and he handled it extremely well.
Well, how is it that tells me about, how is it that he became a hero to the whole culture? I mean, at first he started out as a hero to black Americans. He was their favorite son.
Mm-hmm.
How did the whole society embrace him?
Well, I think somewhat in what I said, that here was a man, it was something like Magic Johnson is today. Here's a guy who you would think might have been chided because of his weaknesses. But because of his charm, because of his personality, because of his humanity, he's become a national hero. And I think Joe was the same way.
Do you think there were political overtones to his fights, like when he fought Max Schmeling, Max, and Hitler's in his rise to his ascendancy, and Joe Louis is a black man? Do you think there were political overtones was there political propaganda around his
Well, there
before
was.
Before you answer, you're going to fix your pillow and sit back.
I think too that because he did become this symbol, which he did become, he was a very desirable commodity to the political organizations in the country and and to the politicians. Here again, there was this common sense that he exhibited. He never got to the point where he would pontificate beyond what he knew. And when he did speak, he spoke in terms that anybody could understand, and very simple terms, and terms that were heartfelt, and I think the people responded to that.
But what about the press and the whole business about Nazism and the black fighter and the racial purity society? Was there much made of that? Was there?
No, I don't think so. I think that there was his attacks on Hitlerism were well received and by both blacks and whites, and I think they were within the temper of the times. And I think, too, that his personal dignity was something that shone throughout that man's life. And this is something I think that the American public, particularly when he won the World's Championship and brought it to America, appreciated.
Great, thank you. One more question.
We have 40 feet.
Let's go for it.
Okay.
Would you say that the 1930s, we have 1 minute to do this, was a time when America opened up for blacks and minorities? Do you feel like the 30s society opened up at that time? Did the New Deal help bring that about?
Well, no, I would say this. I would say that what happened in the 30s as far as blacks were concerned was that the position and the condition that they had been in, largely during what Rayford Logan called the nadir in race relations, that is, disadvantaged people, people that needed work, or people that needed health and so forth, became a situation that affected millions of Americans. So there was greater tolerance for this type of a situation, and a greater feeling that not that it might be I, but that maybe it was I who was in the situation that up to then you had considered to be something uniquely a black situation.
Did we make it all the way through?
I don't think we have the situation unique.
Okay, take 11, change to camera roll 20.
Good, sound roll 11. Okay, if you could just, again, briefly, just tell me about, in those early days, the Citywide Young People's Forum, what kind of group it was?
Well, the Citywide Young People's Forum in Baltimore was somewhat of a unique organization because it was tied in directly without obvious ties with the NAACP, but it was a group of young people led by young people, two in particular, Juanita and Clarence Mitchell. And they would have Sunday afternoon forums, as I recall, and would have speakers, Charlie Houston, Bill Hasty, and I, and others. And this would be a matter of bringing the young people up to date with what was going on in the nation at that particular time, a time when we had depression and we had the new government agencies, etc., and when there was a lot of questions about whether we should go for integration or whether we should build within the structure of segregation and so forth.
What about lynching? Was lynching an issue in there?
Yes. Clarence had, even before that, I believe, he'd been working with the Baltimore Afro-American, and he'd been on the Eastern Shore, than which there is very few areas that are more racially prejudiced than the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And there had been a lynching, and he had reported it, and this had really stirred him up tremendously. So that for some reason, I made several trips over there, I just recall in general. And it was a very live group and a very significant.
Do you know much about the Eastern Shore economically and racially? What kind of a place was the Eastern Shore?
Well, it's Mississippi on the
You start out by saying the Eastern Shore.
The Eastern Shore of Maryland. The Eastern Shore is a disadvantaged economic group, and it's been an economy which has not flourished as other parts of Maryland have. It's really tied around the crabs and fish and that type of thing. And the racial lines are very strongly drawn, And the schools were very unequal. The political activity was practically nihil. There was a black woman in the leading city there, I've forgotten the name of it now, who was a outspoken person, but the leadership was very, very light in the Eastern Shore, and it was an area.
Was it a place that was rife for lynching, do you think? Do you think it was
Yes,
a place that was?
yes.
And why so?
Hmm?
Why do you think it was a place that would have had a potential for this lynching activity?
Well, because there you had complete economic exploitation of the black community. Low wages, horrible working conditions, and insecurity. And whenever anything looked as though you were going to try to change that, then the forces of oppression, the forces of keeping the blacks in their place, and the threat of lynch became an obvious one. It had its counterparts in Mississippi and Alabama, but that far north, it was somewhat of a unique situation.
Great, thank you. Okay, we can
I also want, okay, take 12, camera roll 20, sound 11.
Okay, so if you briefly tell me about Clarence Mitchell as a young man.
Clarence was a very interesting young man. At Lincoln, he had been an outstanding debater, good student, and he had shown qualities there of personal integrity, which were characteristic of him all of his life. He was much more religiously inclined than I was, and but he was not a person who would criticize others as long as they did not violate the rules of decency.
Was he very affected by this lynching business that you saw?
I think he was. If you read the articles that he wrote on this, you could see this indignation that he had, and it was only backed by a lot of courage that he showed too, and this carried through his life. Clarence was a man of principle, he was a man of integrity, and he was a man of great capacity for getting things done and for hard work. And he had a good opinion of himself, not an inflated one, but he had self-confidence, and he had the integrity to apply that and to make his own appraisals real in life. I have great high regard for Clarence.
Thank you. Cut, please.
And oh, he also had great loyalties.
Great people following him.
Yes.
Okay, cut. How much you got?
Mark?
James, take 13, camera roll 20.
A black migrant from rural Mississippi was in the north, and somebody asked him about the South and mules. He said, the next time I say get up to a mule, he'll be sitting on my lap.
Now, when FDR first took office, he seemed to have a tremendous impression on people with his inauguration address and his fireside chats. How did he make you feel?
Well, I think that I felt like most people. There was some magnetism about Franklin Roosevelt, particularly when he opened his mouth and when he was on the radio. He made listeners feel as though he were talking to them and to them individually and alone. And this was a remarkable technique that he had and a remarkably effective means of communication. I remember in those days, if you went through any area where a large number of blacks lived, during the fireside chats, you could hear them walking down the street. You didn't have to worry about getting home in order to hear it, because it would be turned on all the way home. And this was a unique experience, a unique talent that he had, and he also had a way of making an individual story sort of be a collective individual story, and make each individual almost be able to feel that he was on the other side of the table or a participant in what he was speaking about. I think it was a remarkable ability to keep the country hopeful. You know, he said, no fear but fear itself, and the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. These phrases, whether they were written by speechwriters or whether they came out of his head, I don't know. A little bit of both, I imagine. But they did a lot to maintain the morale and the hope in this country in those hard days.
50.
And the other thing that you have to remember is that he came after Mr. Hoover, who was one of the least effective speakers in such situations as they've had for a long time. So the contrast was so striking.
So how much of this do you think was real, and how much of it was FDR, the con man, if any?
Well, I don't think it makes much difference, because I think you have to judge this not by the guy from whence it emanated, but the guy to whom it was aimed and what it did to him. And when you're down in the dumps, if something pulls you up, that's important. Whether the guy who was pulling you up had his heart in a string or not isn't important.
Now, you said down in the dumps. What was it like in 1933 when you came to Washington to work in the New Deal?
Well, I was from Washington, so it wasn't a new experience. But, you know, you had soup lines, you had people selling apples on the streets, you had people hungry, you had people losing their homes by the thousands. And
We have to change, but we'll just pick right up right there.
now people can identify them. My parents were not too affluent. My father was a postal clerk, but he had a salary every month, so we knew it was there. And I had enough to get along with in college, but we certainly didn't have any money.
Okay, now we're going to pick up where
Speed, slate. Speed, slate.
Take 14.
what it was like in People's Conference in the government.
Yeah. Well, the confidence of the American people in the government was at the nadir when the election of 28 occurred. Mr. Hoover had said that prosperity was just around the corner. Well, in the first place, people couldn't see around the corner. In the second place, if they had seen, they wouldn't have seen prosperity, and they knew it.
Excuse me, I have to interrupt, but not 28, but what it was like in 33, okay,
Well,
after Roosevelt, when he takes office and
Well,
things are still difficult.
But by 33, they had at least first a program. Something was being done. Secondly, something was being done in tangible fashion. For example, people who were about to lose their homes had their homeowners loan corporation, and they were refinanced and so forth. And then you've got the relief agencies were being set up, and work relief and the CWA and PWA, all of these programs were helping some. And with that help, since people like to look on the bright side of things, there seemed to be a silver lining in this cloud. And I think that Roosevelt's image of assurance and his optimism was easily transferred to people who wanted to have it transferred to them because they wanted to be optimistic. They wanted to have hope. And he gave it to them.
Now, you worked for Harold Ickes. What kind of man was he?
Well, he was supposed to be a tough man to get along with, the old curmudgeon.
Tell me his name.
And he...
Well, I think you say Harold Ickes.
Harold Ickes was supposed to be a tough man to work with, the old curmudgeon.
Wait. Now, tell me again, but include his name. But let me stop talking first. I have to give you a little room. Now.
Harold Ickes was supposed to be an old curmudgeon. He was supposed to be a hard man to work with. And he was supposed to be something of a seeker of power, but he was, in fact, several things other than that. He was, in the first place, a very, very great admirer of and a very close to the President of the United States. He had access to the President. He didn't hesitate to use it. And he also had 2 jobs, Secretary of Interior and Administrator of the Public Works Administration. The Public Works Administration was an agency which was largely involved in building public buildings and public infrastructure all throughout the country.
Okay. We'll get to more of that in a little while. Did you witness any competition and any rivalry between Ickes and Henry Hopkins for the president's attention and for dollars for their programs?
Well, I think that both of them were devoted to the both Ickes and Hopkins were devoted to the president. And where you have devotion of that type, rivalries are almost inevitable. That happens even in the best families, with the siblings who will be rivals for their parents' affection if they are both interested in security with their parents. The 2 men were entirely a different sort. Ickes was a person who was very much concerned with public honesty, with public accountability, and with spending the public money so as to get 100 cents to the dollar. Hopkins was more of politically oriented in the sense of, well, let's get the money out because that's what we need to do. And of course, it was that which was the popular thing as compared to the Ickes high ideals as to what should be the results. Over the long run, the PWA left a history and an achievement of some outstanding buildings, structures, and institutions. The Work Progress Administration did less of long-time significance. However, it gave a lot more employment immediately, and it kept a lot of people going who would not have been going.
Tell me a little bit more about this rivalry between Hopkins and Ickes. Now, our research indicates there was a situation where FDR took money from Ickes and gave it to Hopkins for his program. Can you tell me about that, and what was Ickes' reaction?
We're out. No.
Oh, I thought you were pulling me.
No, I was trying to lean forward.
The appeal that Hopkins had to the president and to the country was an appeal of immediate relief, immediate employment, and immediate hope to thousands of people who were without jobs. Ickes, on the other hand, insisted that projects be carefully planned, that they be carefully carried out, and that they be carefully supervised, and that they have some permanent value to the community. Obviously, the two things were in conflict one with the other. The needs of the time were in favor of Hopkins, and for that reason, Hopkins, I think, got the better of the conflict.
Now, you referred to PWA projects before. Tell me about discrimination in PWA projects.
The PWA program was a vast program, and it's hard to say that you can describe in any short span of time what happened throughout the program, because various things happened in various segments of the program. It happened that I was interested primarily in the PWA housing division, which was the first public housing done by the federal government. There,
Let's stop for a minute. Okay, let's stop.
Take 15.
PWA discrimination.
well, of course, PWA discrimination was not something that was the result of the PWA program. It was the result of years of practice of various types of situations as involving employment, involving training, which had grown up in this country from almost the beginning. And there was discrimination in some of the PWA projects. There was some discrimination probably in all of them. But there was more discrimination in other than existed in some. This was the holdover from what occurred in the post-Reconstruction era.
That's good. Now, how much control did the Department of Interior have over these projects, these construction projects? Did unions really control and subcontractors really have the control after the money left Washington?
No, not to the degree that in many other projects. But you did have the fact that the employers were tied up with the unions, that the unions were tied up with the employers. The unions had a union shop, which meant that they would supply the labor and that they would restrict the employment to the members of the union. Some of the unions, many of the unions, discriminated against blacks. Some had in their constitutions, had from times back to the turn of the 19th century. In the railroad unions, it went back even further than that, to discriminate against membership on the part of blacks. And with that, the problem of scrutiny was to find out who was doing what to whom. The union said that the employers would not hire blacks. The employers said the unions would not work with blacks. And it took a lot of doing, which we were able to accomplish in one or two programs, to set that straight. And this was what happened in the case of the public works of the public housing program, where we had the first affirmative action program.
That's good.
We're up. Get
That's
on
good. That's good. I don't. I mean, this whole thing is very complex.
Yeah.
You know,
Change sound roll 12. Take 16.
Ickes was very close to President Roosevelt.
I'm sorry, Dr.
He,
Yes, thank you.
begin again.
Ickes was very close to President Roosevelt he soon became one of the communications between the White House and the liberal groups in the country. And he also became one of the persons whom the president looked to continue to maintain communications with the minority groups, Negroes in particular. Ickes at one time had been the head of the NAACP in Chicago. He had very good liberal ties, and had a good record in being concerned with justice for all groups. He also was a man of unquestioned integrity, so much so that the president had great confidence in him and also looked to him in many instances for advice and for counsel in matters pertaining to minorities.
Good. That's fine. That's good. Let's change now to LaGuardia.
LaGuardia was really
Look this way.
Yeah, LaGuardia was really what we would call today a character. He was a short man and rather somewhat pompous at times. He was very vocal, and he was excitable, and he would raise his voice, cry if necessary, but he would get the attention. And you get the attention in any group in which he participated and get the attention elsewhere. He also was backed up, as far as New York City was concerned, by a large number of very effective and very influential legislators in the Congress, so that he was probably the most effective manorial person to get involvement in the various programs that were being established. He had the further advantage of having proposed some of the programs himself, so that he was able to bring to New York City a good proportion and of the goodies that were available in Washington.
Tell me about the relationship between LaGuardia and Ickes.
Well, this was a sort of a problem of two people being somewhat alike and having conflicts of that nature. I remember being caught in the middle in connection with the statutory adornment of a housing project with a couple of lions or tigers or bears fighting, and there were being a difference of interpretation between the two gentlemen as to whether they were fighting or engaged in other activities.
I need for you to tell me that again, but I need for you to tell me who the two gentlemen are. Remember, we have to include that.
Well, between Ickes and LaGuardia, as to whether they were fighting or engaged in other activity.
Now, when he came down to pitch his projects.
Came down to what?
When he came to Washington, D.C. to pitch his projects, he being LaGuardia, was he well organized? Was he prepared? Did they look forward to seeing him, or was he kind of a pain?
Well, I think he was prepared, and I think he was a pain to some, and he was a pleasure to others. It was depending upon whether they wanted the project. If they wanted the project, then he was really a pleasure to behold. If they didn't want the project, he was so insistent and persistent that they were very happy if something would cause an emergency which would require his leaving, because he didn't give up easily.
What kind of opposition did you encounter in the Department of Interior in carrying out New Deal programs? Was there much opposition?
There was opposition in the changes, particularly in the older bureaucracy. You know, every bureaucracy, whether it's governmental or industrial or educational, builds up a series of principles. And anything that goes against those principles, they resist. They resist at first because it suggests that maybe they've been wrong. And they are against it, secondly, because it is contrary to what they call conventional wisdom.
Okay. Did this resistance come from any particular camp or any particular, I mean, was there conservative resistance, I guess? Is a better
Well, it varied from branch to branch in the department. Some of the older departments and some of the older employees, and I speak older in the sense of tenure, not in the sense of how old they were by years, were very, very protective of doing things the way they had been done. All of them were defensive when they were told that they had to change something, because, as I said before, this implied that they'd been wrong before.
Now, FDR, and Stephen asked this question earlier, something similar. FDR needed the political support of Southern Democrats. Now, what constraints did this place on New Deal programs in terms of how far he was willing to push them, how liberal they could be, how progressive they could be?
Well, of course, it's obvious that FDR required the support from the Congress in order to get his legislation through. And it's obvious also that the Congress was largely influenced by the Southern contingency, and that there was a realization on his part and on the part of his staff that you could only go so far and maintain the support in general from the group that had the greatest influence, so that the Southern influence in the Congress certainly limited FDR as to how far he could go. Now, that doesn't mean that that was the only limitation to it. There was the fact that he was not a champion of civil rights, and that he did not have this high on his priority, nor did it seem to him that it was consistent with the other things that he wanted to do. In other words, if he could have done it without losing other things, he might have done it. But if it's meant losing something that he held up as a greater importance, he would hesitate to do it.
Now, if you were explaining to a young person what it meant for you to be a part of the New Deal, what would you want them to understand?
Well, I would think that I would want them to understand that the New Deal represented a new situation vis-a-vis the importance of government in the lives of average citizens in this country. That the type of laissez-faire which had gone on after the Civil War with the great growth of American industry and whatnot was being clipped somewhat. And in that clipping, there were the seeds of getting new developments, new approaches, and new regulations, which would assist and help the people who were in need. And that included, of course, black Americans.
Did you feel that you were part of a movement to make government more responsive?
Yes, but I didn't think that I was a major part of it. I thought that I was among those who were participating in that activity. But I didn't think I was the captain of the troops going over the hill.
Let's stop for a minute.
Okay, we're about to roll out anyway.
Change camera roll 23.
Desegregation of the lunchroom.
Yeah, when I first went to the Department of the Interior, William Hastie, who was a friend of mine and was also there as assistant solicitor, we found out that there were two lunchrooms in the Department of the Interior. One of them was for messengers, and all the messengers were black. And the others were everybody else. So there were de facto two lunchrooms, one white and one black. And we looked at each other and we decided that we were not messengers, so we decided we were going to eat in the other lunchroom. And we went in and tossed a coin to see who would pay for the meal, and I lost. And so we had our lunch, and I noticed that the cashier was very, very nervous. She couldn't keep her eyes off of us. And we played it very cool. So we went up, and Bill went ahead, and I asked how much the bill was. And she said, "Do you work here?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Would you tell me your name?" I said, "Yes." And I told her what my title was, and I said, "And this is Mr. Hasty. He's assistant solicitor, and he works here too." And she put this all down, so then she turned to me and said, I asked her, I said, "Now, would you mind me giving me your name?" Well, for about 10 seconds, she couldn't remember it. But she finally fumbled it out, and I put it down for what reason, I don't know, but it did make an effect. And that was all until I heard from unimpeccable sources that there was a group of ladies came to see Mr. Secretary Ickes that afternoon, and he'd found somebody cheating the government, so he wasn't in a very good mood. And he was sitting at his desk signing something, and he said, "What is it, ladies?" And one said, "Mr. Secretary, you know what?" He said, "No, if I knew what, you wouldn't be here." "What?" He said, "Negroes are eating in the lunchroom." And he kept on working, and when they said, "What are you going to do about it, Mr. Secretary?" He said, "Not a damn thing, ladies." And that was the end of segregated lunchrooms in the Department of Interior.
Do you have any other little anecdotes, stories like that you can tell me?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
Remember, we were talking about 65 years ago.
That's a great story.
Okay, take 18 with steps.
So talk about Joe Louis on the radio.
Oh,
You have to lean back. You have to sit back.
the night that Joe Louis had the first smelling fight, I was in New York, and I had a project running here, a research project was financed.
Excuse me 1 second. Can you look at me when you tell? Can we start again? And will you look at me?
The night of the first Joe Louis smelling fight, I had been in New York that afternoon in the meeting of a group which was working on a survey project which I was doing and financed by the federal government. And on the way up to the stadium, we went through New York as a group. I went through Harlem, as a group. And every radio that you would possibly think could be on was on. You go through the blocks, it's just like you were sitting in your living room and listening to it. And what you missed at the end of this house, you picked up at the next house. And so we went there and were all very buoyed up with this. And we came back. But when we came back, there was nobody on the streets. There were hundreds of people on the streets going up. Not a single radio was on. And it was just as though there had been a tragedy of great moment that had wiped out the neighborhood. Such was the oneness between the black community and Joe Louis at that fight.
Take 19 with Dante.
The PWA program reflected.
Wait a minute. Okay, now
The PWA program reflected the character and the values of Harold Ickes. Ickes was a strong administrator, and he put his hand marks on the things that he did. The thing that he was particularly concerned about was that there be 100 cents of value for every dollar of federal money that was spent. He wanted the projects to be well designed, he wanted them to be well constructed, and he wanted them to be enduring. This he insisted upon. And he also insisted upon having an adequate amount of federal supervision so as to assure these results and assure also that the projects would be sustaining and represent a continuing and permanent contribution to the cities and the communities in which they were built. This was the type of thing that occurred in the PWA. It was a program which required careful planning, which took some long time to get completed, and which, when completed, represented a monument to the sponsors and to the participants.
Was there concern about dealing with Tammany prior to LaGuardia's election? I mean, Ickes was concerned about corruption and whatnot. Tammany in New York was known for corruption. Did LaGuardia's election make him more comfortable?
I think it did, because you see, they were somewhat similar, these two men. They were difficult, they were explosive, and they were involved. And I think he admired, as LaGuardia admired in him, this involvement. But he still had some problems with something that happened in New York City.
How much you got?
Should we cut?
Yeah.
It's 150, cut?
That's it. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, great.
You're welcome.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.